Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Gray Matter for PC and Xbox 360. This is a point-and-click adventure game developed by Wizardbox and published by DTP Entertainment and Viva Media LLC, first in German-speaking territories in November of 2010, then later on in Pan-Europe as well as North America in February of 2011. It was kind of weird because this game was actually released with the English voiceovers and subtitles in the German version. And so, I'm not really sure what caused it to have such a delay between when it was released in German-speaking territories and then finally in North America. But, oh well. This is most notable not for being a French-developed adventure game or anything like that, but because it's Jane Jensen's return to adventure games. If you're not aware of who Jane Jensen is, she wrote the Gabriel Knight games, the first of which being my favorite adventure game of all time. The following two games being two of the best adventure games ever made as well. So, she pretty much had a lot to live up to with Gray Matter, and its development was kind of odd. It first started many years before it was actually released, and it had a very troubled development cycle where it ended up basically in development hell for quite some time. And it was finally released in 2010, so the question becomes there, did being in development hell really just kill this game, or did Jane Jensen really come back to the adventure game with gusto, or what happened in the long run? Well, before we really get into the meat of the game, I do have to address the extremely lackluster visuals this game has. It looks like a game that's much older than it actually is, and I'm not really sure what's going on with that. On one hand, you have pre-rendered backgrounds, which actually look rather nice. They're very well detailed, they are drawn very well, but you combine that with the very odd 3D modeling and animation of the characters and basically anything that's actually going to be moving in the game, and it's just very jarring. While the backgrounds look fine, the characters themselves have a lot of jagged edges on them, their faces look kind of plasticky as far as movement and such goes, the texture work is all over the place, some of them look rather nice, others don't. None of them are particularly high res, which doesn't really surprise me, to be honest with you, but even then, I expected the animations and such in particular to be better, to actually flow really well and to interact with the environment better, but they just don't. There's a lot of odd ghost hands going on where they'll be holding something and they're not actually holding it, or they're holding it very oddly. Just things like that look very strange in this game. And often the transition from 3D modeled object to object in pre-rendered background is very jarring. So it's something that you can get used to after a while, but it's very visually unimpressive, and in fact looks almost archaic by today's standards. And so the visuals are something you do have to get past. It's particularly noteworthy that they have this very odd choice of cutscene, where instead of doing things in the actual engine and with the pre-rendered backgrounds and such, for the most part they have these static images with sound going over them, and it's almost like a slideshow with some occasional movement, like say rain, and it just looks weird. It's a very jarring transition from the actual game to these cutscenes, and while the cutscenes themselves, again, you can get used to them, that transition is just odd, and it takes a while to not only get used to that, but to really learn to appreciate the cutscenes themselves. They work, but they are certainly not impressive, and they could have been a lot better. I would have preferred to see a lot more movement in those cutscenes, because as it stands, they're very static and rather boring to watch, in fact. So you really do have to, with those cutscenes and with these odd backgrounds, you do have to take the visuals with a grain of salt. Sound design, on the other hand, is pretty well done for the most part, although the voice acting is occasionally amateurish and sounds odd in some characters. It's generally capable of the job, and it works quite well. The characters are played reasonably well, they have their own emotional reactions to things and such like that, but I feel like the voice cast could have been more competent. They could have been a much stronger addition to the game, and that would have helped it in the long run. The sound effects are adequate. There's no real way to describe them otherwise. They do what they need to do, and that's about it. But the music is pretty good, for the most part. There are some tracks in there that I don't approve of, but for the most part, it's pretty much what you've come to expect from Robert Holmes, who did the soundtracks for the Gabriel Knight games as well. There's a lot of piano, and it's kind of odd how he's capable of putting a lot of emotion into some fairly simple tracks. So, I really did like the original music that went with this game, but some of the music I just couldn't get behind, like the Scarlet Fury stuff. It was just no. But as damaging as the presentation could be to this game, it's really the story and the gameplay that matter the most. Particularly in an adventure game, the story is noteworthy. And it's even more noteworthy here because it's written by Jane Jensen, and that's always been her big thing. Her writing has always been phenomenal as far as adventure games go. So the question there is how this stacks up. Well, right from the start, it's a very interesting premise, where you play as one of two characters throughout the course of the game, the majority of it being with the first character, Samantha Everett, or just Sam as she goes by in the game, who is a street magician from the United States, and she's on her way to London at the beginning of the game to find this place called the Daedalus Club. It's a very exclusive club for magicians. It's basically like a more exclusive, more eclectic magic circle, if you're familiar with what that organization is. And the idea is that she wants to join up with this club and thus make it big as a magician. Well, on her way to London, she basically becomes lost and ends up in this mansion at Dread Hill, which is where the second character you'll be playing, Dr. David Stiles, resides. He is very eclectic. He was in this horrible accident where he actually lost his wife, and he has just been face deep in his work ever since. He works with neurobiology, which is complicated, but oddly enough in the game they managed to make it make sense and still have this very odd supernatural quality to it. That's another thing that Jane Jensen's always been big on, is supernatural. And so the majority of the game you're playing is Sam, but you do occasionally take control of David, and you're basically investigating what goes on with David's experiments as far as his stuff goes. And with Sam, you're basically going off and finding out what's going on in a more broad sense. You're trying to find out more about David himself, because obviously Sam doesn't know much about him and she has to find things out. And at the same time, you're trying to get into the Daedalus Club. Now, all of this might seem very confusing and very scatterbrained. It's actually not. It all does tie together, particularly at the very end of the game, and it sort of makes sense. And by sort of makes sense, I mean that the technobabble, as far as neurobiology goes, seems at least technobabbly enough that it would make some sort of sense. It seems somewhat logical. I am not a neurobiologist, so I can't go for any validity there, and obviously we're dealing with supernatural things here, but it's a very odd storyline that I didn't think I would like as much as I did, but oddly enough, that was what kept me going through the vast majority of this game. I wanted to see what happened next. I wanted to see what these characters did and where these experiments that David is engaging in actually go. Because once he starts with these experiments, things start getting weirder and weirder. And so it does a very good job of keeping you interested throughout the entire game with what's going on, where it doesn't give you so much information that you can just outright figure out what's going on immediately, but it gives you just enough to keep you interested and have an idea of what's going on, and you can follow along with the story as you're playing and not feel like you're just being led on the entire time, and it actually feels like a very natural progression as far as unveiling the whole mystery goes. That said, the ending is a bit lackluster. It just seems to tie everything together hastily, almost like they ran out of funding and just had to put the ending together and they're like, okay, we got it, move along. Like, there might have been something else to it, but they just couldn't implement it. So, it seems like the development hell process had actually affected this game, even when it finally got to Wizardbox. But overall, the plot to it and the characters are very solid. So what about the gameplay? Well, here's where things get very traditional on you. This is a point-and-click adventure game, and it's pretty straightforward as far as that goes. The interface does take some getting used to. You are going to be using the left mouse button for almost everything. Now keep in mind I'm playing the PC version. I haven't heard anything about the Xbox version, so don't guess on that one. But the interface is very straightforward. Left mouse button interacts with pretty much everything. You have a contextual mouse cursor where you'll see an eye if you want to just observe things and look at them. You'll see a magnifying glass to inspect things further. There will be a hand icon with a question mark above it, and that's where you're supposed to use an item there from your inventory. Now the way you do that is you hover over the top of the screen and your inventory will pop up. You need to scroll through it, find the object you want, and when you find that object, you hit the right mouse button. It loads the object into whatever you're going to be using, and then you can use the left mouse button to interact with the environment, and it will use that item in the environment. There's also the object of magic tricks, and this is one of the cooler styles of puzzle in this game. I really do like that they actually implemented the fact that Sam is a magician as a gameplay mechanic, not just having it to where, oh, she just happens to be a magician. No, you actually do get the magic tricks in this game, and you use them to solve various situations. It's a surprisingly interesting way of doing things, because these magic tricks, you look in the way it's presented to you in the game, which is a magic trick book, and it gives you some very specific things, but you're using them in a very practical sense, where it's not just to be, oh, it's a magic trick. No, you're actually using them to obtain information or to misdirect people so you can sneak things around, all sorts of different things like that. And so they managed to take magic tricks and turn them into this very practical thing. Now, I did feel like it was a bit underused, though, which was kind of sad, because the tricks you're using are fairly basic, and I understand why they would have done something like that, so it would be kind of hard to implement some very complex magic tricks and such like that. And it's a bit annoying that magic didn't play a much, much stronger role in the game, because I would have liked to see that. It's just something that I find very interesting because of my background. But the odd thing about the magic tricks in this game is they're actually the best puzzles in the game. By and large, the puzzles in this game are riddles. And by riddles, I mean you'll be given some text, and it may seem like gibberish, or it may not even be gibberish. It may be something very cohesive, but there's just something in it. And so you need to solve the riddle. There's some of them are just outright riddles, and others are just a play on what you have in that particular text. You just need to figure out what you need to pull out of that text and just understand. And the riddles themselves aren't that hard. In fact, almost all of the puzzles in this game aren't that hard. They just take a while of trial and error, or just mulling over it in your head. And by and large, the big puzzles are going to be the stuff you're going to be doing for the Daedalus Club, which they're big on enigmas and such like that. So you'll be seeing that more and more, and the end game is something that I found the puzzles to be just kind of scatterbrained, because before that they were fairly consistent, and then you get to the actual Daedalus Club, and it really starts to get just all over the place, just outright, okay, now we're going puzzles for just puzzles, as opposed to sometimes more logic stuff that you'll be seeing in the earlier parts of the game, particularly with the stuff that David's doing, where he's trying to sort out neurobiological mysteries and such like that, where you'll have to be just looking at diagrams and all sorts of things like that, more technical stuff, whereas Sam's doing more practical and conceptual things. So you do get a very different style of play with each of these characters, and while you don't get to play as David very much, his stuff is stuff that will almost go over your head as far as the subject matter goes, but the puzzles themselves that you'll be going through with this guy aren't that hard. In fact, they're some of the easier ones compared to what you're going to be going over with as Sam. Now, it's a weird game. Just, you can tell that already from the way I've described it, where it implements magic tricks. The puzzles themselves aren't that hard, but some of them are rather cool. The plot itself seems scatterbrained at first, but is actually a rather cohesive thing. It's nice that they really did work in the two principal characters as they actually are. As in, one of them is a street magician, and you're going to be using her skills as a magician. You're going to be having her stuff implemented into the plot as a actual plot point, as opposed to just her being a magician, and it's like, okay, whatever. She just happens to be a magician. And same goes for David and his neurobiology. So, it's nice that they have all of this implemented. It's nice that the puzzles themselves generally make sense. Now, some of them are just puzzles for puzzles' sake, and by and large, those are just the stuff for the Daedalus Club, but it is a bit jarring going from stuff that actually makes sense and is really a part of the plot to just having puzzles for puzzles' sake sometimes. But other than that, I didn't really have all that many issues with this game. It was just that it didn't feel polished. And while I did enjoy the game, I didn't feel like it was up to par with the previous of Jane Jensen's work. Don't get me wrong, I liked the plot. It kept me interested the entire time. I liked the characters. They're interesting. They have their own quirks. They have their own backstories, and it was interesting to see where they came from and why they are the way they are and that sort of thing. The puzzles themselves, while I wasn't really impressed with their challenge level, I did think that they were kind of cool to implement, and a lot of them did make quite a bit of sense. But there was just something intangible about this game. I'm not really sure what it was. Maybe it was just the presentation, but something made me not enjoy this game as much as I probably should have. And it's not a bad game by any means. I did enjoy playing it. It's just that when I went into this thing and seeing that it's by Jane Jensen, I guess I just expected a bit more. I expected it to be more in keeping with the levels of Gabriel Knight, where it would be that return to the golden age of adventure games, and it just wasn't. It's certainly a good effort, don't get me wrong. I did enjoy it, and I do recommend it. Just don't go into it expecting the glory days of adventure games to be right there in your face all over again. I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.